Hi, I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica, or Hieroglyphic Monad, of Dr. John Dee, using the translation of that work that Nancy Turner and I did that came out a couple years ago from Ouroboros Press. If you've been following along, you know that we're in Theorem 18 now. We've actually already solved the riddle of the egg, which is that first graphic, and now we have the bulk of that theorem yet to go, although we will be drawing upon the egg all the way through there. Okay, let me share my screen and we'll get started here. I'll call the second part of this the riddle of the spiral. Now, it goes without saying that I'm assuming you know who John Dee is. I'm assuming you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is, but by now we're getting into some really advanced material. So I'm assuming a lot more than that, actually. I'm assuming that you have read and understood the first 17 theorems. After all, the LVX sign of the cross used in Theorem 16 has been picked up by 20th and 21st century esoteric groups, or some of them, as the signs of the adept. That might suggest this is advanced material. Also in Theorem 17, we get 252 related to the Philosopher's Stone and the Hebrew alphabet, which, as you know, in the Sefer Yetzirah creates the universe. So we've also seen in the opening of Theorem 18 how he reprised earlier theorems. So hopefully you've studied all that before and you understand what I've just said. If not, there's links to 5 different playlists below. One is to the whole class, one is just on the letter to Maximillian and Printer Silvius, one is to just the theorems, one is to word plays that would take too long to explain to put them in the class itself, and which are kind of fun to explore on their own. And then there's another looking at text that Dee refers to or that are influenced by the monad. So check those out if you haven't. I'm going to go ahead and get started here, though. Theorem 18, if you remember from the last class, or last part of this class, Dee says, from our 12th and 13th theorems, we can concentrate into a whole the concept that celestial astronomy serves as the parent and teacher to inferior astronomy. And now I'm assuming that you know why Dee's notion of inferior astronomy is very different from that which an astrologer in his time or ours would use. I'm assuming you know how it is similar to that used by physical alchemists like George Ripley, because we've talked about all of that below. However, though he's using a concept from physical alchemy, this is not a work of physical alchemy. He's, after all, equated the philosopher's stone to the Hebrew alphabet and the multiplied powers of it. So we solved the riddle of the egg by equating it to the reverse lightning flash order down the tree of life, one that is still used by Hermetic Kabbalists today. So the reverse lightning flash would be, rather than going down the tree after it polarizes and the vessels shatter, you go up the tree, right? So if you're following my cursor, we went up the tree. Yesod, Hod, Netzach, Tifereth, Geburah, Kesed, Bina. And of course, some of those would be polarized off, but the idea of going up the middle pillar is that these Sephiroth that are polarized off are emanations of energy. And so you're going up metaphorically and receiving emanations of that energy while staying on the middle pillar, which we have seen in an earlier theorem, how it pierces the tree at dot and so on. All right, all of that took us back to the work you needed to do to understand theorems 12 and 13. So we're going to look at the spiral in a similar way, but since the spiral will continue to talk about the egg, which is in turn going to lead us to more of a kind of apologia for physical alchemy. I'm using that word the Latin way, right, or early modern English way, as a defense for, not a apology for. So let's look at some of those things. First of all, in the last video, I hope you noticed this graphic, which my cursor is circling now. I put it just in the opening slide, and it's not from Dee's time. It's from less than 100 years ago. It's from Jeffrey Hodson's Kingdom of the Gods book. But the idea was to nudge you into thinking about this egg as something three-dimensional. I mean, physical eggs are three-dimensional. Most of us think that we live in a world that is, in terms of our bodies at least, three-dimensional. So if you look at the orbits or circulations or circumferences that he's talking about, remember that, say, if you look at where my cursor is here, that is an entire orbit, right? And that would be this first one here that involves Bina and Hokmah. It is through Bina that you equate that to, well, the receptacle in Plato's Timaeus, which you also know by now, and that then pierces dot and first creates the middle pillar before it polarizes. And then here you would have the next one of these orbits, so to speak. It gets a little bit more complicated when you look at all of the paths that intersect with Tifereth below. You can still match this up. I'll leave you to do that if you want, because if you take a deep dive into this, it can be, well, not hours, not days, probably, you know, years of your life. It's a wonderful thing to study. But I'm not going to try to explain advanced Kabbalah now. I'm going to go back and remind you some other things about this theorem. Like when he says he's doing a secret analysis of the physics of this mystery. Again, physics meanings pertaining to the physical world. I mean, not only is D before Einsteinian physics, he's before Newtonian physics. There's not a concept of gravity. So when he talks about physics, it means things that in his time pertain to the physical world: geology, geography, medicine. If you ask someone how their physic is, you're asking how their health is. Now, astronomy is an interesting case, because while we might or might not consider that part of the physical world now, in Dee's time, definitely that would be it, how light affects the physical world. Also, remember when he talked about the aperture here, an aperture is just an opening, like a hole, gap, or a slit. And if we look at this drawing, we recall that this aperture is open. The little dot that is usually there in the sun sign, or the sign for gold, or the sign for Tifereth, or all of the above, isn't there. So the idea is that that is wide open and light is pouring through it. That's real important. And by the way, the translation Dr. Turner and I did was the first to remove that dot, because it's easy to think, oh, that's the sun, put a dot in, you're used to doing it. In fact, that's what I did back in 2007. That's what James Egan did. That's what everyone I have seen has done. C.H. Yostin didn't, because he left out all of the drawings themselves, which was less than helpful. So it's important that the aperture is open, it seems to D. And remember, in his letter to the printer, he said not to leave out even one little dot or jot. So we're going to look at some other things here, just reminding you that orbit can mean not just a planet's orbit, but anything that revolves. It can be the circumference of a circle. It can even be something that is patrolling around, protecting something else. And we know, of course, by now that D carefully chooses words, and the words usually have multiple meanings. By the time we get to this riddle of the spiral, I don't think there will be any word that doesn't have a double meaning. Well, maybe the or something like that. Anyhow, also oval and egg-shaped in Latin mean the same thing. It's the same word. When he says presented here hieroglyphically, his interpretation of this celestial council is presented hieroglyphically. That brings us back to our whole discussion about how this connects to 12 and 13. But those, of course, rely on everything before. And then he's also referring to everything since. In 14, there's a reference to the Emerald Tablet. 15, to that famous alchemical quote, nature rejoices in nature, which is an implicit sexual key. And we're going to return to it real quickly here. 16, to LBX is light of the cross. Theorem 17 to 252 has the number of the philosopher's stone, and implicitly the Hebrew alphabet has the multiplied powers of creation. So you have a lot of advanced material. Given that, it may seem a little silly what I'm about to say next, which is, gee, let's think about, what does D actually mean by an egg? What is an egg? Well, we're talking about the physical world, so we know what an egg is, right? It's something that gives birth to something else of its own kind. Like a chicken egg gives birth to a chicken, an ostrich egg to an ostrich. In ways, you can see this as a continuation of the nature rejoices in nature quote from Turbo Philosophorum. there's a typo here. It's not in some versions, it's in all versions, as far as I know, of the Turba Philosophorum. So only a lion can give birth to a lion, and so on. So that's what an egg is, and they are ubiquitous in alchemy, both as a symbol and also as something actually used. They're divided up into parts and used. We're going to talk about those parts in a minute, but if you think about it, eggs in the Renaissance were used in many arts because they were something you could easily get, and you had to use, you couldn't order in something from Amazon, obviously. So like in painting, in Renaissance tempera painting, you use eggs. You use it in all kinds of arts, but you don't even need that as a reference if you're a good cook. If you cook from scratch, you know that you use eggs as a binder in meatloaf, in cake, in any time you need a binder. The first go-to thing for many cooks is an egg. Okay, now look at this graphic here, and again where the cursor is going around. That is the yolk of the egg. So a fertilized yolk is a literal union of masculine and feminine, which we might associate with Mars and Venus. And they are being fertilized by what? By divine light pouring in through the aperture of the sun, Tifereth, sun, S-U-N, sun, S-O-N, all the associations we can make there. Now, we did look briefly at his bashing of alchemists, and let's see where he finishes here by saying, henceforth may the most miserable alchemists be warned and learn to recognize their errors. Well, it seems greed is one of the big errors that Dee, and not only Dee, many pious alchemists go after. You remember back in the letter to Maximillian, when he coins that word vo archidamus and refers us to the vo archidumia of Pantheus, where he has all that marginalia. So we went in and looked at Pantheus, and Pantheus coins the term archemy because he doesn't, even though it seems like his whole work is about alchemy, and most people assume it is, he doesn't want to be associated with the intent of personal material enrichment. Now, why would that be? I mean, why would you be trying to turn lead into gold if you don't want to get rich? That seems kind of bizarre. Well, there's one very practical reason. If you knew how to do it, you'd want to keep it a secret, or you'd get thrown in prison, and rulers might say, hey, do this or else, which is what happened to Dee's later partner, Edward Kelly. But let's look for maybe a more pious reason, because Dee's persona constantly is that of a very pious Christian scholar. Another such person, John of Rupasissa, a couple or more than a couple generations before Dee, says, well, that's because you're doing this for the church, and the church needs money too, so you're doing this for the glory of God. Okay, whatever. But that is the big error that Dee most obviously sees with these most miserable alchemists. So is he ready to change lead into gold and give all of that to King Maximilian? I doubt it. Even if he wanted to do that, as I've said many times before, Dee didn't have a lot of known success as a physical alchemist. That was his later partner, Edward Kelly. So let's go back and look at these particular parts of an egg and see what they're referring to before we get into the riddle of the spiral. Dee then says, for it is widely known by astronomers that now he here is Mercury. We can tell that from what came before, but I'm just reminding you here. In his core through the ethers orbits in the shape of an egg, and I mentioned before that they knew in Dee's time that Mercury had an ovoid orbit. It's called an eccentric orbit now. Mercury and Hermes. Now, since this whole theorem is related to the physical world, physics, it's important to bring in some other concepts in physical alchemy, which we've talked about before, but they've never really been in the forefront. Alchemists often speak of three principles: mercury, sulfur, and salt. They have multiple associations. I won't go into all of them because this isn't a work of physical alchemy, but sometimes masculine, feminine, and androgynous. That becomes complicated, predictably, with Mercury, because Mercury is sometimes masculine and sometimes androgynous, sometimes body, spirit, soul. Usually salt is associated with the physical body. That will be important in this particular riddle. Also, I want to remind you or tell you, if you didn't know this, that there are different kinds of physical alchemy pertaining to the different kingdoms, animal, vegetable, and mineral. So mineral alchemy is obvious. It's where you change lead to gold. Vegetable alchemy would be making not a philosopher's stone, but a plant stone. By the way, there are people alive now who know how to do that. It's not a secret. It just takes a lot of practice and art. I put in a link below to some work by Mark Stavish on that, or maybe some of you have been to Paul Harris's demonstrations of plant alchemy. So what would animal alchemy be? It would be the secret of life itself. That is how to create life. If you are doing this with Kabbalistically based alchemy, it would be making a golem. Or it may instead simply be, for some, how to extend life. The comparison between alchemy and medicine is commonplace in Dee's time. Now, let's look at his other terms here. Here, come to know what the water of the albumen of the egg is. Well, water is often a term for the prima materia in different sorts of alchemy. And this isn't distilled water, and it's not our version of H2O. Obviously, we're way before a periodic table. It's maybe closer to what we would think about as salt water, which has, as we now know, some chemical similarities between seawater and blood, for example. But sometimes in philosophic alchemy, or if we're thinking in the lofty terms Dee is taking through this whole work, you would not be able to exclude the meaning of water as an element, right? In the Timaeus, and all the things associated with the element of water. You can also certainly relate this to the waters of the entire first book of Genesis, which he has referred to a lot. So if you read through that first book of Genesis and God parting the waters and so on, are we talking about H2O? Doesn't seem to me like we are. All right, so the albumen of the egg is just the egg white. If you want a fancy definition, here's one from the American Heritage Dictionary. It's an animal and vegetable principle which occurs in its purest natural form in the white of an egg. That's the albumen. Then he says, out of what does the oil of the yolk emerge? Well, you alchemists, physical alchemists, make oils of different kinds of things. If you want to, you can look on Quora, for example, and find recipes and pictures of people today making the oil of the yolk. But the oil of the yolk was also used by physical alchemists working with the animal, not the mineral kingdom, alchemists in the pursuit of immortality. It was also used as a cosmetic, and it was used to prevent the aging of the skin, as it still is today when it's put in cosmetics. It was used in Renaissance painting, just as all parts of the egg were, where they were separated out, just as they are in physical alchemy. Okay, the chalk of the egg is the eggshell. It's often used in physical alchemy, where it's usually mashed up or dissolved. So we're going to get on to the riddle of the spiral at last in a moment with that knowledge. What I'm showing you on the screen here is what this theorem looks like in its original Latin. And I'm doing this for a reason. It's that, remember back in his letter to the printer, Dee said, don't change the form, right? I've mentioned that just a couple minutes ago. Well, there's no way of doing a YouTube video on this or teaching a class on it in English, frankly, where you can't change the form a little bit. I'm teaching this in a different language that happens to have the same alphabet. But I do want you to see where his graphics appear in this theorem. The egg is first. It informs everything that comes after. All the text is one long paragraph. I have left things in all caps that Dee has in all caps. I've capitalized things Dee has capitalized. But where I have put things in boldface, it's because I want to talk about them. And here's the second graphic that you see, and it's coming at the very end, right before we get some words in Greek. So from the time he talks about the metamorphosis of the egg on, you're supposed to be looking at this graphic. And you notice when the sun shows up there, it's going to have a dot in it. All right, so This is what we have to go. What's left on the screen here, I'm just going to read the first part, which I've made kind of like a paragraph, but remember, this whole theorem is one long paragraph in the Monas Hieroglyphica. So D says, here is the egg of the eagle, which once upon a time a scarab destroyed because of the injustice, the violence, and cruelty that bird had so long introduced to timid and brutish humans. Some asked permission to flee into the scarab's cave, imploring for help and mercy, yet none were liberated. But the scarab, all alone, by himself, judged that he must avenge in every way this injustice. Whereas he had always had a lively spirit, resolved and resolute, and lacked neither the strength nor the ingenuity needed, the scarab steadfastly pursued the eagle in various ways, and by the use of the most subtle art of dung, he caused the egg, even though it had been deposited in Jupiter's lap, to be cast down to the earth and shatter. And by this or some other procedure, the scarab would have in the end obliterated the entire race of eagles from the earth, had not Jupiter, guarding against such an evil, made it come to pass that no scarabs would be flying around them at the time of the year when eagles solicitously attend to their eggs. All right, what on earth does he mean by that? That is our quest here. And how is it going to relate to this spiral? Well, remember when I was talking about George Ripley and interior astronomy, I directed you to the work of Jennifer Rampling and her wonderful essay on Ripley's wheel as a kind of key to understanding Ripley's physical alchemy. And I mentioned that it looked sort of similar to this, and it does. But it's kind of unfortunate that Ripley's planetary order there, if you follow my cursor, is different from D's. Not only that, there is the problem, as Rampling points out, that Ripley's order changes. I'm using this one here because it's the most common. And you can blame the different order to scribal error or whatever, but it changes. Also, what D has over here is a spiral. Ripley has concentric circles. Well, where else have we had some circles that, or at least orbits? In the egg. And voila, this planetary order matches to the most common disposition of the planets. Like I said, there are some others where Ripley puts them in a different order. But so Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars. Of course, Ripley's using the typical symbol for Mars, not the one that D has created back in Theorem 12, but you know why he did all of that. And then Jupiter and Saturn. So that, as they say, is interesting. So put that on the back burner and we will keep going here. And let's look at some other things here. First of all, what he's telling you here is one of Aesop's fables that he has redone. It's the fable of the eagle and the beetle. You can find it online. Sometimes it's called the eagle, the rabbit, and the beetle. And one of the main differences is that a rabbit is usually used instead of a human. It's usually taught to teach the, Aesop's fables end with a moral lesson. So this one teaches you that even the weak can avenge a wrong. Look what the little scarab beetle did. You remember that D had another modified Aesop's fable in his letter to Maximillian, and it also used a bird, which might or might not be significant. I'm not saying that it is or isn't, because as you may have guessed by now, I'm going to ask you to solve this riddle, and then in a couple of days, I'll give you the solution. But you will understand this better and also give yourself some new neural pathways, maybe, if you solve it on your own. Now the scarab, just in case you don't know, it in Latin is scarabaeus. It's a dung beetle. In terms of physical alchemy, dung is often used as a warming agent. D will use it 2 years later when, or maybe it's Kelly, but it's when the two of them are in Trebonia, and D records that he's doing things out in the stables. He records that in his ephemeris, which also serves as a personal diary. So we know anyway that dung beetles consume and breed in dung. Some roll spheres of dung to eat later. So we may want to think, what else can a scarab represent, or is that important? Because something is definitely amiss here. If you think, I don't know how in the original one, how a rabbit can get into a scarab's cave, but I sure know that a human can't get into this little beetle's cave. I mean, this is just impossible. So what is that scarab's cave, by the way? Now, the word in Latin, antrum, can mean other things like a grotto or a hollow. I used cave for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've had the allusion in the letter to Maximillian, to Plato's famous allegory of the cave from the Republic, where, you know, what is in the cave and the shadows you see of the outside are not real. If you go out into the light, it would be totally different. And also, think of the cave of the Pythagoreans, since the Timaeus, or Plato's Timaeus, is a Pythagorean cosmogenesis. So reputedly, the Pythagoreans went into caves to incubate and think about numbers and come out with insights. Now, we may want to think about what an eagle is in alchemy, since it's the egg of the eagle that is so important. And if this is a work of physical alchemy, maybe it's the egg of an eagle we're going to use. So what is an eagle? Well, I'll show you. This is an eagle in the lingo of physical alchemists. It's salmoniac, sometimes called salmiac. It's basically ammonium chloride. What you see on the screen now is an example from Belgium. Let me show you another from Tajikistan. On this one, you can see, if you see where my cursor is, how these crystals have formed off so they look almost like eagle feathers. So the eagle in physical alchemy would be salmoniac or salmiac. It is a white, volatile, water-soluble salt if you grind it up. It, at one time in the past, 1,500 years ago, with the trade along the Silk Road between Egypt and China, it was incredibly valuable. Just a small amount could literally purchase a human life. There also are incorrect associations between salmoniac and the temple of Jupiter, because you have Jupiter here is the only reason I'm mentioning that. And you know, of course, that Jupiter is Zeus. And when we were looking at rotations of great world ages, the second age was associated with Jupiter or Zeus. Okay. So the reason it's incorrect is because it's probably just table salt, where we get that word from. But in Pliny's Natural History 31, he says that there was an ancient source of this near the temple of Jupiter Ammon. So that's why this also has an association with Jupiter. The thing is, we still have that word, Ammon, ammonia. You can hear it, right? So that's where we get the word for sal ammoniac, and ammonia for that matter. So I want to read you a little excerpt about the lingo of alchemy here. I know I read you one before from Jennifer Rampling. Now I'm going to read you one from another expert in physical alchemy, Lawrence Principe. And I'll put a link below, because this is just from an interview with him. I also have below, though, information about one of his books where there's a wonderful discussion of what physical alchemy is. So he says, if an alchemist were using what he would call sal ammoniac, or what we would nowadays call ammonium chloride, we know that it's a white volatile salt. Instead of calling it sal ammoniac, he might call it the white eagle, because an eagle flies just the way the salt volatilizes. Similarly, if you were to talk about, let's say, nitric acid, rather than calling it spirit of saltpeter or something that would be more easy to understand, he might call it the red dragon. Why? Well, because if you heat up nitric acid, you get red vapors. That's the red part. And it essentially breathes fire, this corrosive material. There's corrosive vapors that would come out when you heat it, and it's ravenous. It devours everything in its path, just the way a dragon would do. So if, for example, we wanted to make aqua regia, a solvent that's able to dissolve gold, today we could take nitric acid and put ammonium chloride in it and make that solvent. But an alchemist might describe it by saying, let the red dragon devour the white eagle. Rather than even saying it in words, you might just get a picture, an image of an actual dragon devouring an eagle. All right. So please, if you're interested in physical alchemy, explore his work or that of Rampling. They're probably the two leading experts on this. At least they're the two leading experts that I know of. But I'm going to continue to explore this riddle and figure out, why is this scarab beetle trying to obtain justice for humans? I mean, we have already that these are timid and brutish humans. We can imagine them maybe stomping on a beetle. Why would you want to help these brutish humans? We're also told that a scarab is a lively spirit. Maybe it's volatile like Salomoniac. Maybe not. Maybe it's just protective like Kefra or Kefri. Now, before you tell me that, oh, well, Dee couldn't have known about that, that's Egyptian. Why? That's an interesting question, is it? Could Dee have known about Egyptian gods or goddesses? We know he couldn't have known or understood hieroglyphics, and that's going to be important in a few moments here. So could he know about Kefra or Kefri? Hold that thought. We do know the most subtle art of dung is just a way to heat the alchemical process. Excuse me for the disgusting thing I am about to describe, but rotting horse dung, for example, was often used in the processes of digestion and putrefaction to provide a steady heat. That's probably what Dee and Kelly were doing out in the stables in Trebona, according to Dee's diary. So, does that help you interpret the fable? Probably not. Oh, there's a depiction of Kefra holding up the sun. We just have to figure out, could Dee know Kefra, or could the scarab be something else? Maybe the scarab is just a beetle. Like Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Okay, so then Dee says, and the final part of this, nevertheless, I should counsel those who have been vexed by the cruelty of that bird to learn a very useful art from those sun beetles. A sun beetle is, the way he writes this in Latin is he makes up another word. Of course, he's John Dee. He loves to make up words. But this one he's made up directly from Greek. He says Heliocantharis, and that's directly from a Greek word which breaks down as helio for sun and cantharis for a species of beetle, which is usually called Spanish fly. Then, as now, a Spanish fly was an aphrodisiac. Now, what's interesting to me is this word that Dee made is picked up by a lot of people, and they aren't, I don't know, people cataloging insects. They're physical alchemists. They include people like Oswald Kroll, Andreas Libavius, Michael Meyer, Heinrich Kuhnrath, Athanasius Kircher. You've heard me refer to at least three of those people in this class. It's Kircher with the Kircher tree, and Kircher, who is directly ripping off stuff from Dee. And we talked about Kuhnrath, and Kuhnrath bringing in the Monas Hieroglyphica and some things from the letter to Maximillian and his work on physical alchemy. And I suggested that maybe he's making that association more because of Kelly than Dee. Anyway, have those links to both of those videos below. But Oswald Kroll is a student of Dee's later partner, Edward Kelly. Actually, he even includes a poem of Edward Kelly's stepdaughter in one of his works. And Kroll uses this word as part of his name, Heliocantharis Borealis, for the Polish alchemist Michael Sendivogius. I have a link to an article by Rafal Prinke on that below. So, you know, what is the deal with the physical alchemist and this word that Dee has made up? I mean, are these guys all into Spanish fly? Or maybe they are. Maybe we should look for another meaning also. That is, it's not going to help us here, or is it? The sun beetles, which during certain times of the course live in hiding. The course can be the course of the year, and which year? A solar year of 365 days, a Platonic great year of like well over 20,000 years, or some sort of great world age that is shorter than that. It can be any of those things. It can also be the alchemical process or course. But mainly, this is suggesting time itself as an alchemical process, which we've already seen in the discussion of great world ages. And I mentioned Hesiod in Greek writing, and Ovid in Latin has people who look at great world ages alchemically, going from a gold to a silver to a bronze age and so on. Dee will later here use the word fabulate, which just means to engage in the composition of fables, especially those with an element of fantasy. But we know that it's Aesop's fables, right? So let's read from here on. He says, I should counsel those who have been vexed by the cruelty of that bird to learn a very useful art from the sun beetles, as well as those to whom it would have been most gratifying to have vengeance upon their enemies by giving indicators and signs, even if they do not do the act themselves. If those men were at hand, whose minds edifice first approached to fabulate about the highest mysteries of nature, they would declare, O king, that I am not trying to present myself as Aesop, but Oedipus. To be sure, there are certain people who, if they possessed a dissolved eagle egg, would first by the art of the scarab temper its chalk, and so on and so on. But what about this not Aesop, but Oedipus? Probably he means that he's solving a true mystery of creation, as Oedipus in myth did with the riddle of the Sphinx, and not just telling a story like Aesop did. So the riddle of the Sphinx, remember, is solved by understanding the Sphinx is talking about a man. That is, what creature has one voice, but has 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night. And then there's a second riddle of the Sphinx, which Oedipus also solves, which has to do with the division of time, day and night. So perhaps that's what he's doing. When he talks about, to be sure, there are certain people who, if they possessed a dissolved eagle egg, they would first, by the art of the scarab, temper its chalk with the purest egg white. Then they would cover over this the skillfully ordered disposition of all the liquid of the yolk, rolling and revolving it as the scarab conglomerates its balls. The word there in Latin is pila, and it also can mean globe. So remember, we're always looking for multiple meanings with D. Temper up here just means to add to something to make it stronger. Well, maybe sun beetles have smaller feathers, if you want to think their wings as a feather, than an eagle. Is that what he's talking about? That doesn't make sense. All right, now remember I said when we get to metamorphosis, we're near the spiral. That's what we're coming up on now. Then they would cover over the skillfully ordered disposition of all the liquid of the yolk, rolling and revolving it as the scarab conglomerates its balls. Then a great metamorphosis of the egg would occur. That is a direct allusion to the Metamorphosis or Book of Transformations, which is a Latin narrative poem by Ovid that is much, much referred to by alchemists. And that's one of the ones I was just mentioning that uses 4 world ages associated with 4 metals. Well, let's go on to the end. Remember, we saw when I showed this to you in the original Latin some things Dee had in ancient Greek. We're almost to that now. Thus a great metamorphosis of the egg would occur. Indeed, the nearly involuted egg white would presently vanish, just like those many heliacal revolutions, in its own yolky liquid. The hieroglyphic sign of this work of art will not at all displease the housekeepers of nature. We have found nature rejoices in nature, nature begets nature. Okay, all the discussion we've had of nature. We have found that this most reliable and useful work of art was much celebrated in previous ages by the most venerable and most ancient philosophers. It was certainly from this magisterial work that Anaxagoras afterwards came to make his most excellent medicine, as one can see in his treatise on transmutation. Where my cursor is pointing is where these Greek words would be. That's the title of a work by Anaxagoras, and it has transmutation in its title, but that work is totally lost. So we can't see what Anaxagoras said about this to see if it's really Anaxagoras, a pseudo Anaxagoras. This work is just gone. But as I've already said, the association between alchemy and medicine was a commonplace. So what Dee is doing here is like what he was doing back in that when he was talking about 4 ages, where he said, well, if you want a 4th revolution, it's not going to contradict anything here, even though we realize that he's basically interested in 3 ages. I mean, there's the Garden of Eden, then there's the fall, and then there's the resurrection. But he says it's it's compatible with a fourth age if you want one. That's kind of what D is doing here with Anaxagoras. So that's a good thing because we don't have this work. So we're going to, in effect, ignore those last 4 lines because we can't look at Anaxagoras anyway. I also want to tell you, just for your own information, some things about birds and the language of the birds, if you've heard that term. Now, he is talking about a bird here, and in his last Aesop's fable, he had another bird. There's a bird at the top of the tree in some Persian works. It's the Simurgh bird. That comes into English with Chaucer, among others, but Chaucer is the most famous. So there's a Sufi poet named Attar who writes in the 12th century something called a Conference of the Birds, where King Solomon and David are taught the speech of the birds, and it leads to a common idea in Arabic and then European alchemical and other texts of a hidden language of the birds. That is how initiates talk to each other. So it is, I'm bringing this up because it's not just physical alchemists who do this, right? It's initiates of whatever sort. It's a way to talk to someone and seem to be not making sense, or you're seem to be talking about something else, but instead you're using this language of the birds to talk about whatever it is that you want to hide from the vulgar masses. The 20th century alchemist Fulcanelli talks about this with the langue verte in French, the green language, but it's a play on the hidden language, the occulted language, the language of the occult. So if you've heard of language of the birds or green language, alchemical references in physical alchemy are just one subset of that kind of language of the initiates. Be careful in this instance, though. This bird, the Simurgh bird, is at the top of a tree, but we're talking about the physical world. So any tree we're at the top of is not the top of the Kabbalistic tree of life. That may help you solve this riddle. So one thing we haven't looked at, that's this scarab beetle and the whole question of, could D know this reference to Khepra or Khepri, Egyptian god that's often holding up the sun? We've said it's the scarabaeus, a dung beetle. It's noted for its tough shell-like wings. We could compare those to eagles. But I want to take a minute and look at one place that we know D would definitely be familiar with, and Maximillian would definitely be familiar with at least the work itself. That's the Hieroglyphica of Horapollo. And remember, way back when we talked about the letter to Maximillian, I mentioned this. It was written in 1505. It was bound together with a copy of Aesop's Fables, and it was given by Albrecht Dürer, of all people, to Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, who was the namesake of King Maximilian, who is about to become Maximilian II in 1564. So back then I asked, why would that book in Aesop's Fables have been given to the Holy Roman Emperor as a gift? But since it was, and since the Hieroglyphic of Horapollo was incredibly popular in the Renaissance, we might want to see what it says about a scarab and the hieroglyph of a scarab. Now, what we know is that, first of all, people in the Renaissance could not read hieroglyphs. Horapollo claimed that he could, and when the Rosetta Stone was discovered and people actually could start to read ancient hieroglyphs again, they realized that Horapollo didn't know what he was talking about, and it's just kind of bizarrely humorous now. What he says about the scarab beetle also makes no sense from a scientific point of view, and there are whole articles about that. So I want to read just what one person almost 100 years ago, I think 1928, wrote in looking at the entomology of the hieroglyphics of Horapollo, where this scholar went through and basically tore apart everything that Horapollo says about scarab beetles and says, why is he saying this? I think I can tell you why he was saying it, which is why I'm putting this here. And I think that is part of what D is taking up here. All right. There are lots of different translations of Horapollo, so I'm just going to use it the way Weiss is quoting it in that article, and there's a link to that article below. He says the Egyptian hieroglyph of the scarab is used to denote an only begotten, or generation, or a father, or the world, or a man. So when Egyptians want to do that, basically they delineate a scarabaeus. This is what Horapollo is telling us. And they symbolize this as only begotten because the scarabaeus is a creature self-produced, being unconceived by a female. No, that's wrong. For the propagation of it is unique after this manner. Wrong. When the male is desirous of procreating, he takes the dung of an ox and shapes it into a spherical form like the world. Then he rolls it from the hinder parts of the east to west, looking himself towards the east, so that he may impart to it the figure of the world. Really? I didn't know beetles did all of that. For that is born from east to west, while the course of the stars is from west to east. I guess a beetle needs to know all of that to procreate. Then, having dug a hole, the scarabaeus deposits this ball in the earth for the space of 28 days. For in so many days the moon passes through the 12 signs of the zodiac. All of this is wrong, but this is what Horapollo says in explaining the hieroglyph. By thus remaining under the moon, the race of scarabaei is imbued with life, and upon the 29th day after having opened the ball, it casts it into the water, for it is aware that upon that day the conjunction of the moon and sun takes place. What does the conjunction of the moon sound like? Well, it doesn't sound this way to Weiss when he's quoting Horapollo, because he's a scientist and he's not a theologian or hermeticist. But the conjunction of sun and moon sounds like the Emerald Tablet, doesn't it? From the marriage of the sun and moon. They were the one thing. Anyway, the conjunction of the sun and moon takes place as well as the generation of the world. From the ball thus opened in the water, the animals, that is the scarabaei, issue forth. The scarabaeus also symbolizes generation for the reason before mentioned, and a father, because the scarabaeus is engendered by a father only. I've got to tell you, by the way that people sex scarab beetles now is some of them have male genitalia and some don't. And guess what? The ones that don't have visible genitalia are females. But anyway, moving on here, and Weiss has great fun with this in his article. So we're down here, because in its generation it is fashioned in the form of the world, and a man, because there is no female race among them. I've cut out a bunch of stuff. Every scarabaeus has 30 toes, corresponding to the 30 days duration of the month during which the rising sun performs its course. Scarabaeus is more than 30 toes. And then there are different species. He talks about one of them, and he gets to the third one and saying it's one-horned and ibis formed, and they regard that one as being consecrated to Hermes. Okay, almost nothing here is correct. Why would Horapollo even make up stuff like this? Well, first of all, while people could not read hieroglyphs, there was plenty of traffic, especially among Jewish populations between Egypt and the Holy Land. I mean, Rabbi Isaac Luria, at the time Dee is writing this, is in Egypt. There are many people well aware that scarabs are used as a sign, that people are buried sometimes with a scarab on their heart. Now, whether they know that the scarab is associated with the sign of Cancer, for example, the scarab is very protective of those around it. It would seem by Dee's use of patrol that he did know that, although, as I'll show you here in a moment, he didn't really even need to, because some other theologians he would have read did. So while what Horapollo says makes no sense in terms of Egyptian hieroglyphs, during the Renaissance, you're getting translations of classic texts, and they almost always have a Christian undertone. Now, they can't have a Christian overtone, because some of them are supposed to be referring to things that existed before the time of Christ, right? But they're morphed in that way, that in the works of Plato, when they're brought in, are meshed with the Bible. That's what Neoplatonism is. So to Renaissance Christian theologians, a scarab has a clear meaning. It also is going to make a certain kind of sense in terms of physical alchemy. Father-only generation sounds like alchemists trying to create a golem without, say, women. In fact, many people, myself included, have said, oh, this is kind of... Now, there were a few women alchemists, but trying to create the philosopher's stone for the animal kingdom is like the knowledge of how to create life, or at least extend it. But let's go back to what Christian theologians might think. Only begotten, probably, if you are from the Christian tradition, might remind us of someone else who is very important to Christians. And that person would be the only begotten Son, etc. If you see where I'm going here. It also sounds a lot like a virgin birth without Mary. Oh, the same thing. And in fact, some theologians like St. Ambrose, who was the Archbishop of Milan, and St. Augustine, who was in North Africa. In other words, people who are closer to Egypt or have closer contact with people who have traffic back and forth to North Africa, they compare Jesus to a scarab. That alone accounts for that bizarre hieroglyphic explanation by Horapollo, because he's talking about only begotten, only begotten, because he's talking about Jesus. St. Ambrose calls Jesus the good Scarabaeus, who rolled up before him the hitherto unshapen mud of our bodies. And so he gives Jesus one of the names and characters of another sacrifice god, Horus. Now, a lot of Hermetic Kabbalists associate Horus with Tifereth instead of Jesus. It's the sacrifice god, or it is the adept who, in protecting his or her people, may have to sacrifice themselves. So Horus, by the way, is sometimes pictured as a Scarabaeus with a ball of mud between his feet, even though the reference to a Scarabaeus is usually to Kepher or Kefri. So now you have the reference, right? Jesus is the scarab. That's the reference. I'm just going to repeat that again. Jesus is the scarab. If you read the association of Jesus in Christian Kabbalah, you shouldn't have trouble solving this fable. Associate the scarab with Jesus, Yod He Shin Vav He, not Yod He Vav He, the sun, S-U-N-N-S-O-N, gold anointment, because Christ means Christos, and you are trying to anoint yourself or have the divine light of Tifereth anoint you. Assume the ball of dung at his feet is Malkuth, because this is the physical world. There are two other theological notions you may want to pull in here. We've mentioned this first one. It's the notion of consubstantiality. We talked about that back in the letter to Maximillian, if you recall. It refers to the idea that things that share the same substance or essence, like only a lion can birth a lion, things that share the same substance or essence, and in Christian theology especially, it refers to the three beings of the Trinity, that they share the same essence. And he's going to explore that more in Theorem 21. Now, it's heretical at this time to say something like, say what Unitarians might say, Jesus is just a man, is just unusually evolved man or something. I mean, that's heresy. Yet the notion of consubstantiality combined with another doctrine would seem to suggest that, and that's the notion of hypostasis, which is sometimes even related to hierosgamos, sacred marriage. But hypostatic union is a concept in Christian theology that explains how Jesus can be both God and man. And by the way, I'm not trying to give you a sermon. I'm not even Christian. It's just these are terms you need to know to understand what's going on here. So the term hypostasis means an underlying state or substance in Greek before the birth of Jesus. But Dee has already invited the reader through his constant punning on the letter X, which is the same as the Greek chi, which is in Christos, to become anointed or Christed by raising one's Kabbalistic eye upward to Tifereth, which he and virtually, every Christian Kabbalist I've ever heard of is going to associate with Yod He Shin Vav He, or Yeshua, Jesus. Also, you're going to get to that diagram. Look at the order of the planets there. If you can make the usual Agrippan associations with metal to planets, you're going to start with lead, Saturn. Then you're going to go to tin, Jupiter, and so on. Now, the last one, by the way, will be Tifereth, which is associated with gold. So you're going from lead to gold in that diagram. So let's see if you can solve the riddle in terms of Kabbalah using physical alchemy as metaphor. If you don't have our translation, you may want to take a screenshot here, because this is what you're trying to solve. What does he mean by this riddle of the spiral? Okay. Now, good luck with doing that. You have all the information you need to do it. And like many riddles, it's not a working through it. It's kind of an aha. Oh, yeah, it's this. Remember, D likes to flip things into 3D. You might want to think of what a spiral is in 3D. It's a helix. It's an open curve that rotates around a single axis. So you can look at that if you want. But I will be back in a couple of days, and I will give you the solution to this. You may be a little annoyed at how simple the solution is, but please try to solve it on your own, and I'll see you in a couple of days. Bye for now.